Good day. We begin the third session today, and I am going to speak on very important aspect of city building and city experience, which is everyday life. Everyday life activities which people do and engage on an everyday basis, right from neighborhood life, street life, markets, pedestrian movement, hawkers, livelihood in streets, recreation which happens in parks, rivers, lakefront and square. They become an important element of structuring the city, structuring the experience of the people, human life, and also building a concept of space and experience of human life and a good livable concept in a city as an idea, and hence it needs to be seen very closely. There are many people who have talked about it and referred to it as an important question, and it needs to be understood from that perspective also. To begin with, let us look at what Jane Jacobs brings to an idea of experience of everyday life. 1961 she brought out, the essence of urban life lies in exuberant diversity, in the making available to anyone at any time a vast range of choices of things to do. She is what's referring to one of the very important aspect of urban life, that city must create choices and variation. She also brought out important thing about cities quality of life and activity and space, and hence a question of experience, that streets needs to be surveillance by the human eye itself, and that is what modern cities have failed to do because of the way segregation of spaces and idea of structuring. So, her work has been important to talk about the quality of experience and idea of existence in a city through her book, which she talked about the death and life of great American cities. Another important text which we need to look at is Henry Lefebvre in 1947, as early as that, also defined the significance of everyday life, where he said the world is a man's mirror because man makes it. It is the task of his practical everyday life to do so, and it is everyday life, through everyday life, that humanization is accomplished. So, that is very important to understand that how human aspect and human qualities would emerge only if we look at the everyday life structure very closely and respond to creating the physical structure of the city and the form of the city to respond to that particular aspect. So, it leads us to an argument that everyday life plays an important role in structuring the experience as well as the city form. To me, the two main elements of experience in a city are the everyday life and events. These are two important things which the sessions is going to talk about, and this particular session is discussing the everyday life. The everyday life, however mundane it may be, is one of the significant aspect to be dealt with to create good character and quality of a city. The place to live, place to work and the mobility today are the most important components of the contemporary city. So, that is where I think it is important for us to look at the two aspects of city, which is the everyday life structure and the events. And everyday life itself is a large area of study and understanding, because right from different categories of people, different needs of people, desires of people, and the numbers of people which engage on a everyday basis within a city to move, do things, activities and experiences which emerge from those activities on a daily basis. And that is an important interesting part of the city, which I think we need to look at very carefully, because it is the city which lives and functions, it is the everyday life which shapes that particular aspect and structure. So, to begin with, if you look at this particular image, is a old city Ahmedabad, which was built in 1411, is also trying to tell us the idea of neighborhood life. The first thing I think what we need to look at is the place where we stay, and the other thing what we becomes critical is where we the place where we work. So, these are two important structures of the city, because people have actually come to live in the city for this primary reason, that they live and they work, and hence the city becomes an idea of productivity, and that is the cycle which is actually building this whole structure of everyday life, which ranges from smaller activities, mid range activities, and builds on to that large structure of patterns of activities in life. So, if you go back to this slide and look at this neighborhood image, in which you can see this image very interestingly, a space which actually brings people together. There is socializing, there is interaction, and there is an element which is basically a feeder for feeding the birds. It is an important architectural structure which you can see it is beautifully articulated, decorated as richly as the house of where we stay. So, it tells us the importance and significance of existence, that part of the experience is not just your own needs of a human being, but it is also the fellow animal life which is part of the nature, that we live together with this particular structure of engagement with nature and animals, that this element is actually becoming part of my urban space as an idea, as much as the benches and the platforms where people come and sit as a question. So, I think it is very interesting to see that whole concept of existence and building up this whole idea of everyday life and activity. So, is the other image which talks about how the edge of the building, where the interface of the public and private happens, and it becomes a vital part of that whole engagement to create experience of a particular kind, that the private activity actually comes to the threshold of that public realm and becomes part of the street life also, and the street life becomes part of my experience of private life also. And that is an interesting beautiful equation which the old cities talked about. Same is the question of the narrow spaces, what the old city talks about, that here is a street which is a very narrow street and which emerges from the question of pedestrian scale, because old cities never had automobile and they were planned and designed for walking, and hence this narrow street actually allows intimacy, interactions, a very defined edge and very enclosed space as an idea. And I think that is the beautiful part of that particular experience, as much as you can see the whole idea of expression of identity expressed in this drawing, which was a documentation done of that, that on the ground floor is where people decorate these house elements very interestingly to express their identity and expression, and hence the architecture of those elements are richly carved, as well as we go up they become more simpler. At the same time, they are projected at every level, so that the space at upper level overlooks the public space, and hence an interdependency and interaction which is talked about. So, there is an interesting idea of engagement of private space and public space as a question, which you can see in this image. Early morning reading newspaper happens outside in this space where you are overlooking the street. On the other hand, the new developments actually moves away. The modernism brought a new paradigm as an idea, as a concept, where it completely separates this whole concept of interdependency and engagement of private realm and the public space as an idea. And because one wanted to accommodate larger needs of spaces and requirements, parking spaces and things like that, and more number of people to live in a city, which resulted into this vertical development, also moved away to create a separation of the edge as an idea, but it also allowed large spaces available, unlike the narrow street, and now there is a large space available. I can do more activities of community gathering. Children can play also in these spaces, some of the games are possible, and that is where this concept allows some more from what the old city structure was talking about. So, the housewives come down, as you can see in this image of engagement and interactions. So, it emerges that people come out more into open spaces, either a mother has to bring the younger child, and the grandparents come down to play with the children as an idea. So, the development of the child actually becomes an important question in neighborhood life, and hence the spaces play an important role to allow children to play freely, because these are defined spaces for neighborhood life and activities. So, whole range of activities happen, engagement of children, and hence neighborhood spaces become significant for child growth, because they are going to be the future citizens, they are going to be the future public people who are engaged into the city life in a certain sense. The child has to be stronger, the people would be stronger, hence the city would be stronger, the community would be stronger. But again, these spaces are actually threatened by the very animal negative aspect, which is the automobile, and that is the conflict which the city has to fight, that these spaces are now being encroached and taken away by the growing numbers of vehicles and private ownership of vehicles, and the expansion of the city which engages into mobility structure which demands private vehicle ownerships as an idea, as a concept. On the other hand, the vertical development also has resulted into anti-human concept or experience or a condition where actually the people are separated from each other vertically, and hence it actually reduces the number of engagement of interaction, and it has actually increased private space and private experiences more, and hence they are supported by the gadgets, the equipments, which is the television and the private music systems, the home theater concepts and things like that. And I think that is where the idea of public space and the experience which was happening outside in the public space has moved into the private space as a question, which is something which is bothering and needs to be looked at as a question, as an idea. On the other hand, public space has also built up this interesting story of vegetable market which happens at the neighborhood scale. So, it is not the open space, it is also the market activity which brings people out onto the street. So, you meet people, engage with interaction. So, they also become another platform of activity which happens in these market spaces. So, everyday buying vegetables become an activity which is not that I need vegetables, it is also engaging into socializing of a certain kind, and hence it is an important space for engagement and experience of community life. The entrance of the house also becomes an important place for interaction. As you can see in this image, the entrance space actually a person walking down the street would stop and talk to the person who is sitting and watching life pass by. So, it becomes an important element of engaging and interaction, the entrance space, as much as it is an expression of identity which you can see in this image. The grand display of architectural articulation is a sign of symbol of how people want to express their identity in the public space. So, is the idea of animals being part of the urban streets, the neighborhood concept and the life as an experience. So, it comes from the basic concept of traditions what we have been following from ancient times, that we exist in the concept which actually allows us to understand that we are part of a larger system and structure of ecology, where nature, animal life and other things are very much part of our life, and that emerges from the Hindu concept which has been defined. And I think that is an important aspect which has shaped this neighborhood structure, activities that every day you need to feed animals, and hence the stray animals become part of my street life and activities, as you can see in these images in the city of Jodhpur, which we have been looking at as a question. So, it is an interesting idea of experience, that it is not your individual needs and desire, it is collective living of your fellow human beings as a community, and nature as a larger structure as an idea, which I think is an important and significant part of existence and experience. Narrow streets and tight spaces have actually built a lot of interesting urban scapes. We can see in the case of Jaipur city also, that there are these concepts of narrow streets which have resulted into definition of the rich, tight, intimate spaces, interdependent activities which happen. At the same time, narrow spaces, the Gandhi Gali concept which Jaipur talks, has been a problem today for modern life as a question. The expression of facades and activity, the entrance definitions, and you can see in this image how a space is being created for people to sit. Hence, a question of engagement, of interaction, human interaction as an idea. The expression of colors and displays and artwork is also telling us the question of expressing identity as an idea, which you can see in the documentation, that different people actually do different expressions, and it is not a repetition and monotonous expression of architectural idea. It is that rich characteristics of individual expression actually builds an interesting street facade. Hence, the street becomes an interesting formation of a physical definition as much as the human interaction and activity. So, both the architecture and the human experience are actually together in this particular street formation as an idea. Taking and talking about streets, I would like to go to another level of discussion where a street becomes a marketplace, and it is an interesting phenomena of formation. It is an important urban space, and it is an important urban activity which I think shapes an idea of experience as a question. This particular study, which was trying to study one particular example of Market Street in Pune, which is looking at a primary layer which the formal buildings are organized based on the logics and principles, and there is a layer of active space which is being referred as furniture, that people come and occupy space and with their equipments, it forms the next layer. And then there is a layer of extension of those certain activities which happen, and then there is a layer of dynamic elements which is the human being and the people and activity. All the layers put together actually forms that particular story of Market Street, which is what the Pune street study is trying to refer. And going into the details, if we can look at that, how at this scale we can see the building, the space, the informal activity, the extensions of the shops, the way they are happening is what something which is being studied and looked at as a question in the analysis what we. So, different time periods, how the shop opens up and the surface starts changing, and you can see in the section how the shop opens up and gets extended into the street space, and that is what the display comes out as an idea, and then it is occupied by the informal activities at the next layer of activity. So, there are different layers, all the 4 layers being talked about in the street is being discussed here and documented. So, the street actually transforms in the day, and the street becomes wider with the shops where people can enter and walk into and do the shopping. So, as an idea, there is a flexibility of the space, the way it unfolds and move as a question. So, the layers are actually creating those stories of experience, the stories of urban architecture, the way it unfolds, and it is all happening because people come there to buy things, and there are people who want to sell things to the people, and hence it is an important engagement of interaction of both the formal and informal. Hence, the question of layers is what being talked about in this particular study. On the other hand, there is a question of informal activities in the street, which has also always played an important role to build an experience, and the question of form and characteristics, that we not only do things inside the buildings which are abutting the streets, but there are things which are layered outside, which are informal, which come and occupy for various reasons and factors of poverty, economy, livelihood and other things, but they build an important structure of activity, hence an important structure of experience, which is what Indian streets actually become vibrant and lively, that they are constantly engaged and filled with activities, as you can see in this particular diagram, that they are as informal, and it is not a fixed layout, but it is a layout which keeps changing as people come and occupy these seats to have a cup of tea or food, snacks or something like that, and that is what this tea center basically it becomes an important engagement of informality. This study is further studied by many people as a research, because it is an important area of characteristics of Indian streets, that informality actually builds a interesting story of not only experience, but it also builds an activity of economy of a certain kind. There is a parallel structure of formal economy, which is the building and the shops talk about, and there is a parallel structure of economy which this informal activity talks about as an idea. And you can see that pedestrian movement, vehicular movement, the hawkers, the footpath space and the shops are together as an idea of formation, and it is an interesting experience of walking through these particular streets, engaging with those activities, buying things from the street and buying things from the shop. They are always simultaneous activity. So, there is a question of what is the private space, what is the public space, and what is the informal space, what is the vehicular space, and what is the pedestrian space. Now, these territories and definitions are very blurred the way they happen, and that is where the question is being talked about and being referred, because informal activity has not been recognized so positively by a lot of development systems and processes, and that is where in many cities they have always been subjected to being thrown away and thrown out, and hence an important experience of urban life actually moves out of those questions. And now actually it is an important question, how though they are happening in many streets, almost all streets of this city, that they are constantly there on a everyday basis. We need to look at it closely, what is the reason why they come about and how they need to happen, so that the vehicular space, pedestrian space and informal activity in hawkers needs to be structured to create an interesting story of urban scape. Now, this is also happening because people walk and people move in a certain way, and hence and it becomes important, as you can see in this diagram study, is how to look at pedestrian movements and look at how people walk and where these hawkers stand. And actually it is where people walk is where hawkers actually come, because they are engaged with those pedestrian peoples at activities at a certain question. So, where people walk is where hawkers come out, and hence it is important, and at the same time the shops also structure this mobility pattern of people, how they move. So, it is not just hawkers, it is also the formal structure of shops and activities and the informal activities which shape these pedestrian movements. So is the activities within the space. So, there are people stand and people are engaged in activities. So, they become subspaces of activities as an idea. Of course, they are driven by food courts and other informal selling which happens on the streets, or there are places to sit. In a certain sense, people actually sit on vehicles, because many of the places sitting space is not provided, benches are not provided. So, the vehicles parked become the seats for those interactions and experience of activity. So, people want to sit in certain spaces and experience those activity. So, this informal activity actually moves on to become an important characteristic of Indian streets, and has been a area of study for many people, and hence you can see in this diagram of edge of a particular place becomes available for informal activity, and it becomes in a very organized structure of activity on a everyday basis, and people actually come every day to this particular destination to be engaged with this informal activities, and they range from food activities to shopping to selling things and experiences of other recreational forms which come to the streets as an experience. So is the idea of being alone in the street and finding personal spaces for different kind of activity. Reading newspaper early morning is also an important image. What you can see, it was documented by Henri Cartier, one of the important French photographers in 1960s in Ahmedabad, and I looked at some of the examples in other cities. Is an important activity which has been constantly occurring and has been significant part of an urban space, and it is an important experience of knowing early morning what is happening in the world. So is the idea and question of sitting in the street space is an important thing which many of the streetscapes and public spaces have not been provided, and you can see in these images small towns or bigger cities, people would like to sit and watch life pass by, and that is an important thing. Resting, watching people is an important aspect which is a constant activity in the day. You can see here in Panjim, go after lunch hours, people were sitting at this place in a shaded space to have a rest before they go back to their tables to work. It is an important aspect because this age is not designed for sitting, it is actually a fence which becomes a seating space for people, and hence an important thing to understand. We need to look at these particular experiences of people and to shape the lives in the city. So is the aspect of street food. It is not that we go to buy things in the street, we go to walk from home to work and work to home. It is also engaging that while on the streets you would like to enjoy and engage with the fast food or eating something. It is also eating things, different varieties and spices, but it is also experiencing standing in the street and eating. So, Pani Puri is an important story which actually began in Delhi for a particular purpose of medicinal quality which was exercised during the Mughal period, but it has now become an instrument of recreation, that it is not a biological need, it is an experience of eating pani puris in the street, and hence the fast food eating on the street actually becomes an important experience and characteristics of lot of streets in the world. And actually in Europe, sitting out and eating in the street and drinking is a most beautiful experience and is the most expensive space to be enjoyed and used in a certain sense, which in the Indian street also emerges and has been playing an important role. Yes, from the question of poverty and livelihood, but it is also building up a very interesting idea of experience. So is sitting alone in the streets. You can see in Limdi, Jaipur, Banaras, all cities you go, people would like to be alone and contemplate, and hence public space actually becomes an important space for individual person, collective activities, and community gatherings and engagements as an idea. Another important aspect is of the streetscapes and activity which builds a particular kind of experience is this street as a theater, which is something which used to happen at particular time. Today it is a dying art. This is a street activity, is a means of livelihood, it is a means of entertainment and recreation, it is a means of awareness of the community also. So, it has multiple dimensions and roles to play as an activity, and I think today is being replaced by other means of private experiences, the television, the private music space, and auditoriums and other things in the house, and these kind of activities are actually dying out. So, that is where it becomes important to understand the relevance of these particular aspects which were part of the experience of the public realm. So, is this whole idea of hawkers who actually occupy these spaces is actually a means of livelihood for many of the poverty. Now, it is here I would like to say that in India even about 40% of the urban population is poor, and in some cities actually is more than 50%, and hence it is an important means of an activity and experience. So, it is a livelihood question also for many of the things which are happening on the street, and hence the activity of every day also emerges from this particular equation, and they become the part of the landscape of the street and experience of the street. As you can see in this image, is a place to stay for many people in this cities, and in Mumbai actually 40% of the populations actually live like this, and that is where it becomes an important question of to look at what are the experiences we are talking about. So, on one hand there is a question of recreation, social engagements, another thing there is a question of poverty and livelihood on the other hand, which is also being part of that particular experience. On the other hand, what we referred in the earlier presentation of sacred urban space, the sacred activities, the temples, shrines also emerge on the street, and they become daily life activities. So, the traditions and rituals of this particular part of our tradition and history has also brought them to the modern landscape of streets, where these activities actually start happening in cities today in a new form, which is the smaller shrines which actually spring up for daily activities to perform certain rituals. Streets also become workshops for many livelihood activities, and that is where you can see in this street people are engaged in fabricating and manufacturing some of the bamboo screens out of the bamboo sticks on the street space. Street also becomes an important livelihood space for many, and it is an important social space. The tea vendor is actually an interesting example of that particular idea of experience, that it is a livelihood aspect as well as it is also a issue of social engagements and interaction. They become an important place for many friends to meet, old people to meet, everyday life activities which bring lot of people engage and interact in a certain way. So does this part image, which is also an important question. People do activities and businesses in a certain way. So, cobbler, who once upon a time was a major important activity, is a dying element, and is a endangered species today because of many reasons of the changes the modern life has brought, the productivity and consumptions has looked at. So, it is an important thing of shift and changes. Some of the activities have actually becoming extinct. This is another activity. You can see the barber on within the street in the open space is also emerging from that particular equation of poverty, but it is the landscape what you see as an idea. So does hawkers bring an important display as a visual experience as much as experiencing of buying and bargaining which happens in this particular landscape. It is an interesting image to show us even what are people looking at. So, right from what are the interests of the people of the modern life is something one can see in this image, all the different displays of icons, idols, beliefs, landscapes, images, concepts of existence and things like that. You can see in this particular posters which are being which is what the hawker is trying to sell, as much as the same images actually go on to your t-shirts, and they become important aspect of expression of identity and values, and that is where I think it is an important thing which the hawkers, what they sell is something also brings out that image of experience, how modern life is trying to look at the questions in a certain way. Uh, Going back to the question of urban activities, this image brings out an important story of urban systems, where every day a city needs to consume certain things, and that is where this particular image shows us how for everyday evening restaurants, dinners, that this number of chickens have to be transported and distributed in by means in different modes in a certain way, using the hand carts and the baskets, the way they are transporting. So, it is an important activity of a city, which actually allows us to understand, in order to create an experience of a everyday dinner in restaurants for all the families, there is a system which needs to be in place to bring that numbers in time. And same is the story of flowers. The traditional aspect of our cities is also building this whole equation of the flower market, which is emerging as a strong form. And a city like Calcutta, every day morning this number of volume of flowers has to come, so that all the rituals and individual experience of houses and smaller shrines and temples are being performed. So, the question of market and the activities actually builds this whole idea of systems and experiences around those systems as a question. And Jaipur city was an example where the idea of systems and market structure was actually laid in the planning stage, and the idea of streets were designed as a market, and hence they became the places of interest. So, today the jewelry market, Johri Bazaar, becomes an important place of experience of doing the daily shopping or events in a certain way. So, the city's forms actually builds up that particular question of everyday life activities, systems, and hence an idea of experiences as a question. So, is the Manek Chowk in Ahmedabad actually builds another question of experience, where monument, history and market, shopping and open space, a dynamic open space actually builds another argument of experience, where everyday life and events and come together to shape this whole idea of a place. And that is where Manek Chowk has become an important public space for the city like Ahmedabad. On an everyday basis, people actually look for this destination for experience, and in the day it is a busy market, and in the middle of the busy market are monuments and quiet spaces where certain rituals and activities are performed. So, there is this simultaneous layers of activity happening and duality of spaces, which are important characteristics of these experiences. So, that space actually begins with this early morning activity of filling water or feeding the animals, which one talked about, that we need to live with nature and animals. So, they are also part of that particular Manek Chowk. So are other markets in the city. So, they have emerged, markets have been important activity of cities, whether they are festivals or occasions. Even tourism also builds up a market idea and a particular experience in Jaisalmer city. So, does coming back to the question of walking in the city as an activity, and people do walk in a certain way, and it is important to observe and document these things as an activity, which is what being studied. In this example, what you can see, people move in different ways. People are strolling, walking fast, going to the destination. People want to spend time, hence walk in a certain way. But at the same time, people walk in cities differently, where volumes are huge, and Mumbai actually shows us a very different image. There is no space to walk, and hence they have resorted to separate the people who walk and the people who move through vehicles, and hence it raises the question of interdependency, where shop, pedestrian, hawker and vehicle actually are interdependent, but because of the volumes and numbers and conflicts, we start separating them. Is that the right way to look at the cities or not, is the question what we need to ask. Of course, vehicle and pedestrian conflicts has led to many problems, and that is where it is becoming important, and everywhere it is becoming a problem and is being seen as a urban hell. And I think that is where it raises question to look at, do we move in a certain way and hence experience the city in a particular way. And I think there are important modes still available in cities, which cities are being following, and there are questions of sustainability and other issues which have raised the modes of transportation. So, older modes are still part of my city experience, where people are using an activity, everyday life happens in a certain sense. Nightlife is also important thing, which probably is an interesting part of experience. So, the Manekchowk space actually becomes a important food court in the night as an important experience, and also people look for spaces without cars. So, the parks and lake edges and where vehicles are not available are important spaces people look for everyday life. Everyday evening people flock to these places for important moments in life to experience that quietness, togetherness, socializing, family life and children's playing area, things like. At the same time, people also travel distances to go to places for recreation. So, recreation has actually forced people to move out because cities have not been offering important experiences. Hence, there are many examples which look at these whole idea of experience. Cities have created promenades, cities have created ideas of experiences and these all these things we need to document things in great detail, the activities, the way they happen, the behavior of the people, the engagement of an equipments with which these activities happens as patterns, and hence this is an important thing which we need to document extensively and look at it as a question. So, I think it is an important to know that everyday life becomes an important area of discussion to shape the experience in the form of the city, and I think it's important to look at this particular, and that is what this session was trying to talk about. Thank you.